Well, good evening, and thank you for being here this evening. My name is Chase Rend, and I'm the director here at the National Building Museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's program, which is actually the final program of the Community in the Aftermath series. This series is illustrative of the variety and the scope of topics that the museum covers in its mission to explore our built environment. The Community in the Aftermath series is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, along with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, in partnership with the museum. We are truly grateful for their support, and to Dana Bress, who is a research engineer with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, for helping us to coordinate this series. So thank you, Dana. Over the past 3 years, Community in the Aftermath has focused on the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Alternative Housing Pilot Program, better known as AHPP, which is a grant program to develop more viable, versatile, readily available, and cost-effective post-disaster housing for the areas affected by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Past programs have focused on AHPP projects in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and post-disaster planning in the New York City metropolitan area. These programs examined the performance of the housing units themselves, as well as their role in encouraging community recovery. We all know that the effects of Katrina and Rita are still being felt today. Indeed, we are reminded once again about the impact that disasters, both natural and man-made, have on our built environment. When we see current news coverage of the aftermath of the earthquake in Japan, and even closer to home, the effects of the tornadoes in the southeast of our country so recently. Tonight, we are pleased to have a distinguished panel of speakers that will focus on lessons learned from the various AHPP projects and how those lessons can be applied when providing housing to disaster survivors with the ultimate goal of faster community recovery. In order of appearance, our speakers are Catherine Fox, who is the Housing Division Director for FEMA, Mikhail Schlossman, who is the AHPP Program Manager for FEMA, Larry Buron, who is a Senior Associate at ABT Associates, Dana Bress, who is a research engineer at HUD, and finally, John Peavy, who is the Director of Applied Technology at the National Association of Home Builders Research Center. Following their individual presentations, the panelists will reconvene on stage to take your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Catherine Fox.
All right, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm Catherine Fox. I'm in charge of disaster housing for FEMA. For those of you who have attended previous presentations, I represent a new face and a new organization overseeing the Alternative Housing Pilot Program. A little bit less than a year ago, we did a reorganization. Thank you. Sorry if I'm drowning you guys out there. We did a reorganization, and so we have incorporated AHPP into the overall division, the Individual Assistance Division, that's responsible for providing assistance to individuals and households impacted by disasters. So that is a little bit different from the organizational structure when the grant program was first created. We had it separate as the grant program was getting off the ground, but now as we're starting to wrap up and starting to see the conclusion of the original grants, we wanted to make sure that we have this program positioned so that we can best learn the lessons and apply those to our typical disaster programs. In response to Hurricane Katrina and Rita, we entered into the largest disaster housing operation in the history of the country by more than 10 times. We ended up providing over 140,000 direct housing units. And at the height of the 2005 hurricane season, we provided overall assistance to over 1 million households. So that was more than 10 times what we had provided in the past. Typically, we only provide up to 18 months of assistance, and obviously due to the unique circumstances of Hurricane Katrina, we are now almost 6 years in. Luckily, more than 99% of families that we assisted have now transitioned into longer-term or permanent housing. we still do have some remaining in our traditional temporary housing units. And that's why this program is so important. As you can see by the authorities, Congress gave us unique authorities to be able to provide grant programs in order to assist the 2005 hurricane-impacted areas, in part because they recognized the need for new and innovative approaches in addition to the traditional disaster housing mission. When people think FEMA, I think it's become ubiquitous to think about the FEMA trailer. But in actuality, we actually provide direct housing assistance in very few disasters. Only about half of the disasters end up with enough individual property damage for us to provide individual assistance. And in that, more than 90% of the time, we're able to make use of existing disaster housing or existing housing stock and providing some financial assistance so that people can avail themselves of buildings and structures that currently exist. When we do end up providing a direct housing mission, only 1% on average of our applicants end up requiring us to bring in some form of direct housing. And that's really the slice of the pie that the AHPP is helping us to better improve and to try to adapt some of our traditional approaches so that we can meet needs of communities, have better acceptance in a community, and really start to think about the difference between an immediate temporary solution versus something that's more able to transition into a longer term type solution. As I mentioned, we've moved this program into the individual assistance division so that we can learn these lessons more thoroughly, but our objective has been in two different areas, both to provide housing, given the shortfall of housing in the Gulf Coast region, and also just to learn these lessons and new ways of doing business. So specifically in the grant guidance, we want to evaluate various different types of disaster housing alternatives, and we want to be able to evaluate the feasibility of those different types of units in addition to looking at our traditional forms of travel trailers, park models, and then HUD-regulated manufactured homes. In doing this, we found a very different scale of needs throughout the different grantees and the different populations that have been impacted. And Mikhail's going to talk about the different grants in far more detail. But as this program nears its conclusions, we definitely want to capture lessons learned related to the innovative approaches that we've seen here, different types of building materials, different types of structures, as well as different ways of providing that assistance. And something that, again, can be more easily adapted by communities to provide more of a sustainable and permanent solution. I think this program is a great representation of the collaboration with HUD, collaboration with the states and localities in our grantees, and it typifies the FEMA administrator, Craig Fugate's vision that FEMA is not part of the team, or FEMA is not the team, we are part of the team. So we're trying to build on our partnerships here. And again, that's focused on trying to enable better recovery outcomes overall for the population. So now I'm going to turn this over to Mikhail, who's our program manager for AHPP, to discuss the specific grants and the implementation steps.
When we talk about the implementation of the AHPP, essentially we're talking about 5 grants, and these 5 grants went to 4 states, and this is a different structure than when we would normally use in FEMA. The grant structure puts the grantees sort of in the driving seat of doing the work, and I'll be able to talk a little bit about those roles. What's interesting to us is that each of those grants offers a unique solution to this post-catastrophic environment that we've been operating in. And what's also been important in this is that relationship with HUD in terms of performing the building and social science evaluation. One of the pieces that I would add that's been a topic of conversation among us with HUD and the evaluators is that we've been very interested to see not only the building science and the social science, but interested in seeing how it is that the grantees go about doing this work. Because those process pieces, those things about how that work is done, can also be highly instructive. The program itself was designed to deal with protracted community recovery timelines, where the situation that we faced that is so unusual is these very long periods where there's a very long housing need. And this creates a unique set of situations. Many of the housing missions that we see in other circumstances may last for a much shorter period of time. And so what do we do in those circumstances? What is the right choice? How is it that we then approach those questions? AHPP becomes a component of helping us to better understand that environment. We also see that in these environments, a shortage of resources for home reconstruction and uncertainty about community recovery. That when this program began with the legislation in 2006, there were plans, there were ideas, there were notions about how communities were going to move forward, but the uncertainty was strong. And in many ways, what we've seen is we've seen that evolution, both guided and natural, as it's moved through sort of what we might call a recovery profile. The other thing that we see is that there's been a resistance to the use of traditional temporary housing. And the solutions that we were looking for were to find things that would help us to better integrate with the particular needs of the individual communities that we were operating within. And that's where I think placing the choice in the hands of the grantees and the state, and us working with them through a cooperative arrangement, where it's us with the states and the states with the locals, creates a very different environment than we might see in other circumstances. When we're talking about the evaluation, we definitely had some specific goals to develop lessons learned for semi-permanent and permanent housing, and that was through a range of project designs, to understand each grantee's implementation process, to assess the mechanism that they used in order to build and deliver, to look at the relationship of the community to these projects, and to evaluate the impact that these projects might have on the individual recovery of those people who are going to occupy these units, as well as perhaps a little bit of the relationship to the community, but more specifically about those folks who were going through a very difficult recovery process themselves. One of the things that does differ here with the way FEMA would normally go about doing business is the federal roles. That in this case, our role was essentially to fund the projects, to monitor compliance with the scope of work that we had agreed upon with the grantees, to ensure that the laws and regulations were being met. We did provide and still do provide limited amounts of technical assistance to help guide and ensure the grantees have the information they need from us in order to move forward as quickly and effectively as they can. And we have encouraged grantee collaboration. So we've been very deliberate about wanting to make sure that each of the grantees were not only learning through the process and building their own capacity, but we're learning from each other. And so we've tried to foster that environment through a variety of different methods. We evaluate the projects, and much like this, we perform outreach in order to educate people on the program and to educate people on the lessons learned that are being derived from all of this work. The grantees have been responsible for managing the projects. They have been developing the structure, they have been designing the units, they select the sites, they select the eligible applicants, although there are specific criteria that we worked with them on. They maintain the project scope, and they implement the project itself. The grantees had certain requirements that they did have to meet and that we worked with them on, which is the environmental requirements that would come with any federally funded project of this type. The building science components in terms of ensuring that we were dealing with the flooding issues and making sure that they had addressed the mitigation components, that they had addressed the wind load components that we had agreed upon, that all were intended to build safer housing in the future. The accessibility issue has been key among all of this work, and we have worked very closely with the Access Board. We're very grateful for the assistance that they have provided in terms of providing us guidance as well as providing guidance to the grantees, and ensuring that these units do the best job that they can in providing services to a variety of people who have a variety of different needs. And then sort of the legal component of just making sure that they comply with what we would call the Articles of Agreement, which is the agreement between FEMA and the grantees about what work is going to get done, how, the requirements, and in what timeline. When we talk about the projects, we still principally talk about them as being organized around the 4 states, and part of it is because of the way Mississippi organized. We have a project in Alabama, we have the project in Louisiana, the project in Mississippi, and one in Texas. The Alabama project is essentially a single jurisdiction, modular type housing. In Louisiana, it's multiple jurisdictions like Charles, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, both in infill as well as in group sites. Some of it has been manufactured in essentially factory built, and much of it has been site built. And that was one of the interesting variations that occurred in Louisiana that I'll be able to speak to a little bit more. In Mississippi, we saw primarily what we'd talk about as the MEMA cottages. And these were much more the type of unit that we might see, except on a different, in a disaster, but on a different scale. They were generally dual coated. They had a park model which was roughly 397 square feet. They had a 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom model. And these units were done both in infill and in group sites, first on a temporary basis. And now what MEMA is working on is what we would call the temporary to permanent. So they're working on that permanent phase. In Texas, we were looking at a panelized unit, which essentially is flat packed and something that can be truckable as a flat pack and then assembled. Each of these different types of projects did have some things in common, which is that each project and management agency explores a different solution to a particular need that was identified in that locality. We were looking at addressing a specific need in housing with Gulf Coast Recovery, and that is helping to address those people who were in temporary disaster housing at the time of construction and at the time of completion, and trying to ensure as much as possible that those people were afforded an opportunity and a solid way so that they could transition from what would be a traditional THU into something that might be longer lasting or something that might help them in a different way. And again, we talk about this pretty regularly, is the importance of the evaluation work. The overall timeline of this project has been started in June 15, 2006 with the evaluation. We moved forward through the application and selection period in September 15th through December 22nd of that year. And following that was what we'd call a negotiation period, where after the evaluation of the grants, we worked with the grantees to identify specifically and narrow down the scope of what those projects were going to be. And from there we moved into an implementation period, and generally that implementation period was originally designated to be 2 years, and then there was going to be a 2-year occupancy period. Now I think when you hear Larry talk, you'll hear that all of these plans change when we meet the realities of the specific situations, and we meet the realities of the specific needs of the people in those communities. So the program needed to adapt, and again, that's where we provide technical assistance in order to maintain a level of flexibility so that we can work to meet the individual needs and still make sure that the intent of the program is still met. In terms of the budgets, we see that Mississippi received a fairly large grant at $275 million. The Eco Cottage received $5.8 million. Louisiana received $74 million. Alabama received $15 million. Texas received $16 million. These grants were awarded based off the type of project and the nature of the proposal. They weren't based off of another perception of need. They were based off how it is that each state elected to make use of the grant opportunity, and our discussions with them about how that grant opportunity could best be met. One of the things that's interesting in Mississippi is that this temp to perm phase that I talked about. First, it began in temporary work, and again, these are the 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, actually 3-bedroom cottages. Mississippi started with this model of working to put these units down on a temporary basis. They worked with communities in order to be able to do that, and then later on, they worked with the communities in order to be able to put them in a more permanent phase. And Mississippi is still actually in that work right now of attempting to transition these units from temporary to permanent use. One of the things that's an interesting experience that has happened here that is, I think, quite unique is that there were some tornadoes in Yazoo City, Mississippi that occurred. And these tornadoes damaged a certain amount of housing stock in the area. In a traditional disaster, what would happen is that FEMA would supply housing as needed under our IHP rules. What happened in this case is that Mississippi was able to essentially address the housing need primarily through their own resources meaning surplus cottages that were available, had been constructed through this grant. Mississippi was able to establish that program, and in a sense, MEMA was then able to lead that direction of that housing recovery for 1906. That's the disaster number that we use. And what FEMA was able to do is support the state in doing that activity. And that was a very unique and unusual circumstance. And it's something we're still really paying attention to see what lessons we can learn and draw from that experience as well. Louisiana's work has probably the largest variety of units that we see in terms of square footage and size. And one of the challenges Louisiana faced has been community acceptance. Another has been the duration and the amount of time that it takes for some of these units to actually be constructed and put on the ground, and how that matches the recovery profile or the trajectory of recovery of the individuals that have been the people the needs they were trying to address. In that work, from a structural point of view, I think John will be able to talk a little bit about this in terms of one problem that they ran into was the rate of construction, and the way they addressed that problem was with the site-built units that were steel frame, and also to make a variation on their designs that could be manufactured in a facility, and then to transport those and install them in much the same way we might see in other places. Alabama's model was to address the large loss of housing stock in Bayou La Batterie. That model created two housing developments that are actually adjacent, which is Safe Harbor Landing and Safe Harbor Estates. It was 100 units. These 100 units are all occupied on the ground right now. It's being run by a housing board. And what's so interesting to us in this case is this represents a very interesting transition of grant-funded housing to a housing board that's locally run, ultimately to what they're doing now is heading towards a public housing agency. So this is a transition of FEMA-funded units to something that's managed by the community through a HUD structure. Texas was panelized units. They began with infill sites and group sites. Primarily, they ended up with infill sites. They did a small number of these units. These panelized units were essentially the flat-packed units. They were brought in and shipped in, stored in a warehouse, and then brought in and built. One of the challenges that they faced was the difficulty of acceptance of this different style of construction. They also, in terms of the acceptance, it was also finding the people who were able to know how to navigate and deal with that particular type of construction, which is so unique. Throughout the program, we've dealt with common misconceptions, that FEMA owns the units. It's actually the grantees that own the units. That all alternative units are AHPP units. And in FEMA, there are multiple efforts, but there are two principal programs. One is AHPP, and the other is Joint Housing Solutions Group, that deal with alternative units, trying to find different ways to address unique problems. One of the other misconceptions is that all the units are Katrina cottages. In fact, the Louisiana units are often referred to as Louisiana cottages. The MEMA units are often referred to as MEMA cottages. Each is a different type and differs from what one would see as being the typical Katrina cottage. For the HUD evaluation reports, what we're expecting and what we've been working with is that there are going to be project case studies for each of the projects. There's an interim evaluation, and then there's a final evaluation. And we have the interim evaluation that covers Mississippi, and we have the two of those case studies published online at our website on FEMA. And I'm sure we can get the website to anybody who needs it. It's www.fema.gov/AHPP. I think one of the things I wanted to speak to as well is, in the overall process, is what were some of the things that we saw from a FEMA perspective that were very interesting to us. One is the capacity issues. Who has the skill set? What skill set do they have? Do they have the appropriate skill set to be able to execute the particular mission that they're trying to accomplish? And how quickly are they learning the things that they need to learn in order to get that work done? Each of the grantees had to go through some process of discovery. They had to figure out this work. And what we also hope in the AHPP is that through that process, they've learned, and that learning has stuck, that learning becomes a part of the resident capacity of that community, of that organization. Thanks. Community support is key. That there were challenges in differentiating the AHPP units from the travel trailers, the park models, and the manufactured units. The things that had gained a stigma for a variety of reasons. And trying to meet those particular needs of those particular communities at a particular time is very time dependent. Where you're at in the disaster, when those needs and resources are available, is going to influence the decisions that get made, and particularly which options can be selected. Meeting local requirements is a challenge. One of the things that we've seen in the AHPP and we've seen in other areas of disaster housing is that the rules that a community has for what kind of housing can go in don't necessarily change because a disaster has happened, which means that there's got to be some time that is worked out between those people who are trying to provide the support and resource and those people who have the demand and meeting those community rules and regulations. Now, communities that think about this ahead of time, this is the pre-disaster planning component. This becomes key. When we look at the AHPP work, there were similar issues even later in the disaster environment, later in the recovery environment. In terms of the resources, I think what we talk about is the key aspects of the teamwork that's involved. Dana talked about the engineers, the designers, the planners. What we're talking about is collaboration also between all of the levels of government and the communities in order to solve a joint and mutual problem. And the kind of coordination and effort that takes is pretty extraordinary or massive, as if you go back to the original work that Catherine was talking about of 140,000 units, or if you talk about the work in Mississippi for this specific program of 3,000 units. In terms of the lessons, we already know in terms of the implications that what we're thinking about is how this work will influence the future of disaster housing. We're thinking about how this work influences our work at FEMA, how it influences community education, how it influences the things we discussed with HUD and how that works, how it influences community recovery and those folks who work in that long-term recovery area. What we're thinking about is the question still. We're thinking about how best do we reduce the time between displacement and reestablishing a sense of normalcy? What in the AHPP can we learn from those components? And what in other resources can we learn? We still know that FEMA's primary objective is to not necessarily engage in a disaster housing mission if it is not necessary. What we want to seek is we want to seek other remedies that assist the community faster and better first. And those remedies come from home repair, existing resources, working with the voluntary agencies, that come from people being able to be enabled to do their own self-recovery, and if they need assistance and support, to receive things like rental assistance through existing resources. Housing missions are difficult. They are not easy, and I think the grantees experience this as well. One of the questions that really comes up that's interesting to us is what are the most effective ways of organizing to implement disaster housing? In the case of MEMA, we saw some very good progress that worked very quickly. It was run by an emergency management agency, and the initial eye that they had on the ball was quick turnaround, quick output, quick placement. And then when it came to the permanency phase, it wasn't necessarily thought about as early as perhaps people might have wanted to think about it. They ran into difficulty. One of the things that we might have seen in Louisiana is seeing challenges where the work between the construction side and the work between the occupancy side may not be as well integrated, and it takes both together. So there can be delays between the time in which a home is constructed and the time in which a home is occupied, and we want to minimize that time. what methods are best suited to address the recovery profile of a community, are more questions we ask, all prompted by this work of the AHPP. Is it that a temporary housing unit is the appropriate? Is it back to the rental assistance? What is the formula? And in a sense, this is where I think Catherine again points to something that is key, which is engaging what we would call the whole community in the work, and doing so as early or prior to the event as possible. So that when we do this work, people are prepared, have thought about it, and are ready to take those steps, and perhaps we can minimize the human suffering that's occurring as a result of the displacement. How do we balance the need for safe, cost-effective solutions, manageable solutions, and the short and long-term community recovery needs? I think as Dana pointed out, there's no specific solution that seems to be that silver bullet. That each of these situations that we see in the AHPP was an attempt to address a specific problem within that community, within a specific framework. And that each of those even ran into their own challenges. Would it be the case that there's going to be one particular type of housing that would solve all of this, or one single solution? I think what we see from the recovery work that's taken place in the long frame from Katrina is that it takes a lot of people and a lot of effort and a lot of support from a lot of different places in order to make all of this happen. And in terms of the short-term versus the long-term decisions, I think Dana points out that some short-term decisions have long-term consequences, and sometimes if you're seeking the long-term decisions, you don't necessarily have the time to address that problem. So you need to make the rapid decision, the life-sustaining decision. What are the most effective ways and methods of engaging communities to create these collaborative solutions? I think in the AHPP we are seeing examples in the case study work and what's been seen of things that worked and things that didn't. Early community engagement, how it is that they approach the community, the level of degree that's involved. Is it the case that the local ownership is going to speed the process? Is it the case that it's the state coordinating with the local governments? How is it that we create the best alignment, the most vital alignment that's going to solve the problems the quickest between the local communities, the states that are providing resources and support, and the federal government that provides support on top of that?
My name's Larry Buron, and I'll be talking about the quality of life evaluation part. And just to give you a little graphical, compared to what Mikhail talked about, there's a building sciences evaluation and a quality of life evaluation, and I'm going to talk about the quality of life, and that's the people side. So who is being helped by the program, what their perceptions are of the units, and the people side of the implementation. So I'm just going to go through each of the 4 sites and just give a few observations about each site. And I'm going to do it in order of when they started implementing their program. So Mississippi was first in starting to implement. Mississippi is the largest by far program, and they were also the fastest to implement their program. They implemented and designed, built, and installed about 3,000 units within 2 years. Their program was made, they didn't provide the land for the program, so people had to have their own land. So it was, a lot of homeowners were assisted by their program, and then other people lived in mobile home parks on their own pad, or some people got units on friends or family's land to put their units on. This is the only one also run by, the state was the grantee, and there was an emergency management agency of the state that ran the program. Each one has a different type of entity running the program, which is partly what drives, I think, some of the results. And they were very fast at implementing the program, as you'd expect from an emergency management agency. I think Mikhail already showed you pictures, but the top ones there are the park models. Those are the 1-bedroom units. The bottom are the 2- and 3-bedroom Mississippi cottages. You can see on the far right picture, you can see the ramp. One of the themes of this is going to be is about 1/3 of the population in each of the sites are going to be people with disabilities, or some member of their household has someone with a disability. So a big part of this was meeting the UFIS requirements and providing ramps and wider door frames and things like that. And you can see the park model is, the big has a kind of the open great room, and then in the back, past the kitchen, is the door that goes back to the bedroom. The Mississippi participants were different than the other sites, and mainly most of them were homeowners prior to Katrina. And again, that's probably driven by both the area that the disaster occurred in Mississippi, it was a homeownership area, and also driven by their program, that they didn't provide the land for the program, they provided the house. The other thing about a lot of them were older and disabled, so a lot of single-family households were helped, and that was the park model. The median income was about $1,500. They actually served a very wide mix of incomes. There was no income eligibility requirements for this program, and Katrina hit some very large houses as well as smaller houses and didn't discriminate and destroyed them. So people of all types of income levels were helped at this program, although on average it's pretty low income. The people who lived in the unit, we interviewed them about a year after they lived in the units, and the participants were extremely pleased with the units. They reported very high quality, especially compared to living in a FEMA trailer or a mobile home. One of the things they most appreciated about the units was that they really felt like they were living in a home again. And what's interesting about that is Mississippi was very clear. This is temporary housing until your other permanent housing is rebuilt or until you find new housing. But the thing that came across most in the survey of what they liked about it is they felt like they were in a home again. And some of the things that they pointed out were like, we have a front porch to hang out in. We have a full kitchen, so now we can have families or friends over for dinner, which we couldn't do in the trailer. We have a full, there's some privacy with the bedrooms, and in the trailers there's like a curtain that goes over the sleeping area. In these cottages they had doors that shut, so there was a lot more privacy. They also pointed out things like they had a bath as well as a shower in these units. So even though they knew that it was temporary housing, one of the main benefits to them was that they felt like they were living in a home. And it actually showed up in other things too, which is like, for example, in the mental health, we asked a series of questions about mental health issues. And one of them was about how often in the last month you felt hopeless. And we compared the responses prior to moving into the AHPP unit and after, and there was a big decline in the number reporting any feelings of hopelessness over the previous month. And other mental health issues had similar, some of them had similar breakdowns. Some of them didn't change, but some of them had similar improvements. So just a few observations on the Mississippi program. They were able to do their program very quickly, to design, construct, and install temporary units, and that's a key thing because they were the only site that planned only to have temporary units to start off with, and they were able to do that very quickly, and that probably is the closest to stimulating a post-disaster response. As I think Mikhail brought up, they have run into more problems when they've now tried to convert them to permanent housing and to demobilize, and that has taken a lot longer than they'd hoped, and maybe it's something they didn't start quite early enough planning on, is that part. They were so focused on getting the houses up quickly, not as much focus in the beginning on demobilizing what would happen at the end. There's some consensus that the park model and Mississippi cottages are a better solution for long-term temporary housing. Again, this idea that people feel like they're in a home now, that they're in a permanent setting. Even if it's temporary, they feel like they're in a real home, and they can start the recovery from the disaster more quickly. They did face, both in the temporary, but even more importantly, with the permanent placements of homes, community resistance. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is this program started a couple years after the disaster, so they didn't have that kind of urgency that you'd have right after the disaster, when kind of all hands on deck, everybody helping everybody. So they ran into a lot of problems with meeting zoning requirements and not getting any waivers and just not getting acceptance to build a group site anywhere. So they only built scattered site. There was some NIMBY issues, even though there was a wide range of incomes of people using the program. The people who would be moving into land that wasn't previously owned by them were on the lower income side. So I think it was more of an economic NIMBYism, and there was things like square footage regulations. These units aren't very large, so that they didn't meet their zoning requirements. And there's also a stigma associated. Even though these houses, I think, look very nice, there's a stigma with the fact that they are modular homes. I think there was one quote from a community leader that said something like, if it has wheels, it's a trailer. Even if it looks very much like a regular house. And as I said, they're still struggling from the transition from temporary to permanent housing. Okay, Alabama, the unique thing about Alabama, they had the smallest grant, and they're the only grantee to be the city rather than the state. And one other thing I should mention in contrast, okay, so in Alabama, the city basically had the program, turned it over to a contractor, an experienced CDBG developer. Mississippi, what I should have mentioned is they had a huge program where they hired a developer as well, and they had an integrated MEMA and their contractor team. They actually had like 100 people working out of the same office space, working very integrated team, and a very large-scale team, over 100 people at the peak. Alabama was a very small team, but the city worked in partnership with the contractor who they turned it over to, but the contractor really ran it. The city was more or less their client, not an integrated team. What they ended up doing is building a 100-unit site outside of town, so they're the only one who really built a group site. And they built it on an area that was unincorporated land before, and they incorporated it into the city. It's out of the flood zone. That was very much the focus of the mayor of Bayou La Batre, is he wanted it out of the flood zone. During Katrina, he had been out on his boat rescuing his constituents from the rooftops, and he wanted, his focus was out of the flood zone. And so that's where they built this new development. And interestingly, you know, with 100 units, this city of 2,000 people that's probably about, I think we figured out between this and the CDBG units that they built, it was like 17% of their housing stock was being now placed outside of the flood zone or elevated above the flood level from combination, but mostly from this program, but a little bit from CDBG as well. And as Mikhail said, their end game is they're turning over the rental of the management of the units to the Public Housing Authority, actually at the end of June this year. The board's already in place, but it's officially going to be turned over in June. Here's some pictures of the units in Alabama. They came in, delivered in trucks from Florida, half the house on one truck, half on another, and then they put them together and did the finishing touches here at the Bayou La Batre site. Okay, the Alabama participants, these were of all the sites, the poorest participants. Their average median income was $800 a month, so about $10,000 a year. It's a poorer area than the other areas, so that's part of the explanation. It's also a rental housing program. You know, unlike Mississippi's, where you had to have your own land, here they were providing the land as part of the program so it could serve lower income people. A lot of disability. It's also very racially diverse, just like the community. The community is about 50% white, 10% black, and 33% Asian. So there's a little on the people who chose to live in the AHPP units are a little bit less Asian and more white and more black than the rest of the community, but it's diverse, as is the community. The participants here also reported higher quality units and feeling healthier and safer. Interestingly, 28% still reported crime in their neighborhood in the follow-up survey. But yet at the same time, they responded to questions about, do you feel safer than when you lived before? And like 90% said yes. Bayou La Batre, for a small community, does have some crime problems, being it's kind of a lot of bayous for boats to come on in and bring in illegal substances. But one of the things we're going to come to about this, the manager of this development, is she's been very aggressive in recognizing, making sure she doesn't want it to be labeled as a crime area, and has been very aggressive in making sure it isn't. Both here and in Mississippi, too, one of the big improvements of those who have a family member with a disability, here it was 80%, I think in Mississippi it was 90%, said the accessibility was much better than the previous place they lived, which was and better than a FEMA travel trailer if they lived in a travel trailer. And that has to do with, does someone with a disability have an easier time using the bathroom by themselves, getting in and out of the unit, moving from room to room, using the appliances. Some observations. The experienced developer was key, and the fact that that developer got the key stakeholders in the community to buy in early before they moved forward. She worked with the mayor to get the city council and other city leaders on board. A flexible leadership focused on problem solving. One of my favorite quotes from them is, they said, "We view problems as a detour, not a roadblock." One of the examples of it is they actually started out their program as a home ownership program, and then they realized that A, they didn't know how to run a home ownership program, but B, that the people couldn't afford homes without a lot more subsidy than they could provide. So then they started moving it to a lease-to-own program. And then they realized that was going to be a long time before their participants, the people who needed permanent housing, were going to be able to buy a home. And then they moved it to a rental housing program, and then they found a way to have a long-term rental program by reestablishing a PHA in biodebauchery, which didn't have one before this program. I think they had one a long time ago, and they kind of restarted it. Again, she identified, the developer identified key livability issue in that area would be crime. They have criminal background checks on the leases before you can get a lease, every adult member, and they're also been very aggressive about if there's any problems about following up on lease violations. Leveraged funds for amenities. This is, I think, the only site that really reached out. All kinds of grants. She got some of them other government grants from HUD or other grants from the Department of Agriculture, but also from foundations, Points of Light Foundation, the Bush Clinton Foundation, to do things like put trees in their development area, to build a playground, to build a community center, money from the Department of Transportation to make a deceleration part of the road for going into the development, a grant to put sidewalks in, because there's actually located very much near the local school, so now that people from this development can walk to the school. And again, I mentioned the impact of 100 units is really big in a community this small. Okay, Louisiana is a state, is the grantee, and a state agency is managing it. It started out as a state housing finance agency and is turned over to the local redevelopment authority, which then was subsumed by when that went out of business, it was subsumed by the Office of Community Development. So Alabama is the second largest, Louisiana is the second largest program and definitely the most complex. They have, in building 479 units, they have some mostly home ownership, but they're working with 10 different partners in 3 different areas of the state. So they're working in Lake Charles, which is out near, which is mainly affected by Hurricane Rita, which is out near Texas, closer to Houston than to New Orleans. And they're working in Baton Rouge, which is about an hour northwest of New Orleans, and then multiple sites in New Orleans, including a very unique site, a National Guard station, where they are building, there's been officer housing there before, but they're building housing for the soldiers there for multiple reasons, but one of which is because then they will be housed there for emergency response in the future. So they're doing a little bit of everything. They do have some group sites. They have infill. They have scattered sites and a few multifamily buildings. So far, they're about halfway done with building the units. And most of the rest are under construction. And they also are the only ones that are providing case management to help people buy their home. This is, again, mostly home ownership. But they're all over the place. Some of the units are going into a Hope 6 development. Some of the units are going to Habitat for Humanity they're working with. So it's a very complex program. Their end game is that all these units will be run by either rented by nonprofit partners or sold by nonprofit partners when they're done. So that's how they're transitioning for the long term. Here's some examples. The Fisher site is the Hope 6 site. Baton Rouge, I think, were the first ones built. Those are the ones in Lake Charles on the top. Okay, so we only have information on the applicants, not the actual people who live in them yet. There's a survey in the field right now, and that's because Louisiana has been the last of the 3 sites to occupy. So we don't know. What we have now is on applicants who have been accepted into the program, into the case management. And it's different than the other sites. They're a little bit higher income. 70% are working. That's compared to 50% in Mississippi and 23% who are working full-time in Alabama. So it's a different population. It's primarily African-American working families. Their median income is $2,000 a month compared to, again, to, what did I say, $1,500 in Mississippi and $800 in Louisiana. And you would expect there to be a slightly higher income population for this because it's mostly a home ownership program. And even with the subsidies and the counseling, they have to be able to pay for the rest of the mortgage and to pay operating costs ongoing. They're still very, they're not, I mean, even median of 2,000 is $24,000 a year in Louisiana. Most were renters before Hurricane Katrina, unlike in Mississippi where most were homeowners, because again, the land is coming with the house in this case. And a lot of the, you know, just to show, of those who lived in FEMA trailers, about a third of them had lived in FEMA trailers, and 40% of them had lived in there for over 2 years. So they do have and this is the people who are accepted into the program, so they do have people who have really been without permanent housing, and you know that there's had to have pretty limited options to be living in FEMA trailers for over 2 years. Observations. I think their strategy of working, they didn't start out with all this idea that they were going to have this many nonprofit partners. They thought their agency would be running more of the building of the units, but as they've gone along, they have adapted and have a lot more nonprofit partners who are locally community-based, and I think that has worked out well for them in getting the program moving. But part of the reason I think the program was slow to get off the ground is they actually, in addition to moving across state agencies, they actually had a very small staff for how much they had to do. I mean, again, this is the most complex program, and they had about 4 or 5 staff working on it, and not even all of them full-time. And they hired a developer who had only had previous development experience with one development. So I think that explains the slow development process. They had to put a lot of effort along with FEMA, who was doing the environmental reviews and helping them in doing environmental reviews, doing historical reviews. A lot of New Orleans has historical significance, so you have to review for whether this development will affect any historic artifacts. So that's been an extra complication, and it's resulted in a lot of times in land they have chosen to be part of the development has had to be turned down. But part of that is, again, pointing to the inexperience of the developer, not recognizing what land might not have been a good land to choose. And so they've spent a lot of effort and time doing things that have not resulted in finding a place to put their units. And they've sometimes, you know, with the change from agency to agency, there's a lot of decisions that have already been made. And so when it moves from agency to agency, even though a lot of the same people also moved along from agency to agency, they kind of took a lot of previous decisions as fixed with no flexibility. And sometimes that was limiting when they were trying to get this done. The last one is Texas. This again was the grantee, and the Community Development Agency was the managing partner. They planned to build about 100 units, about 40 units of scattered site housing in a rural part of Texas, and then 40 to 60 units in group sites in Houston. Again, I think you saw the pictures from McHale. They had containerized metal housing. The big benefit of this housing is that it was supposed to be easy to put up, easy to take down, and could be shipped in very easily either on a truck in those container boxes, on a train, by ship. Lots of different ways to bring it in. But Texas, for multiple reasons, which we'll talk about at the end, withdrew from the program in summer of 2010. And by that time, they had built some of the 6 scattered site units in East Texas, and they had not built the group sites in Houston or Harris County. There, they could not find the land. Either Harris County or Houston could not find viable land to put the units on. These are what the units look like. I think, again, McHale showed you pictures. Part of the problem there, they had a very small staff again as well on the program. You know, their program was actually much smaller. It was a $16 million program. They also had a big CDBG grant that agency was running at the same time of about $500 million. So this program did really seem small and maybe didn't get, in the beginning, all the attention it needed to get off the ground. And then they didn't have a lot of staff working on it on an ongoing basis. And their contractor, they didn't have site staff. Their staff were based in Houston, where the development was happening either in East Texas or in Houston. And their contractor was inexperienced as well in building. Their contractor had built in housing in helped housing like in Iraq and kind of those kind of places where they had large plots of land to work on, but they hadn't built scattered site before, especially not in a rural area without their own staff putting it up. One of the things they ran into is there wasn't any construction expertise in putting these units together. So even though they're supposedly really easy to put together, they didn't have that expertise in the areas they were trying to put it, and it wasn't really worth it to the local staff to learn that expertise for this small number of units. They also underestimated the assistance needed by the participants just to apply for the program, just to prove that they had title to the land so that they could actually put the unit on the land, to prove that they did not have previous FEMA assistance that would make it double dipping to get this unit. So they needed a lot of extra assistance of just the applicants they did end up helping. And Mikhail mentioned there are some reports available on their website, and more will be available in the future. Thank you. John?
My name is John Peavy, Director of Applied Technology, worked closely with a lot of the grantees, also with Dana Bress, HUD, had a very comprehensive team of experts in building science. So you had engineers, architects, you also had experts, we also had experts in the area of factory-built housing. We also had industrial hygienists on the team and a few other experts who were good in the area of inspection and energy and HERS ratings and things of that sort. What I will do is talk about the scope of the building science evaluation, which is basically captured on this slide. 7 areas, including design, construction within a factory, field construction, indoor air quality, also energy and air infiltration, moisture, long-term durability, last but not least, maintenance, tracking and history. If we think about what the premise of the alternative housing pilot program was, and you think about what the benchmark for comparison was as well, you can look just at those pictures of actually installed houses versus some of the travel trailers that were used right after Katrina and just see aesthetically a big difference in the appearance of the housing that was built through this program. If I look at some of the technical differences between the designs, the biggest difference was the wind load requirement, structural requirement for these houses in comparison to travel trailers and some of the other structures that were built. Another huge benefit was the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, the UFAS for elderly or seniors or people with disabilities that needed to be able to get into these units. What was noticeable and good about this program was that you actually had a UFAS variant for every model of the house that was available through the program. Energy was also a big focus, so at least 2 of the programs actually had an Energy Star rating, which is really good when you compare to a lot of the housing stock that might be being built right now. Also, we coined this term resource efficient, not just because these houses were built within factories, but also some of the approaches that they took to construction exemplified what you would want to do with sustainability and with green. And at least the Mississippi and the Alabama houses would have gotten very close to a baseline rating of green if they had done some land resource development as well. So that was the biggest thing that was missing within this program. So if they had started and tried to become green formally and become rated, they had the potential to do that. Now that's even noting that they have within the Mississippi program an eco-cottage product that is, designed for LEED and for a formal green process. But if you really take a close look at some of the things that they were doing within the construction, it's very good work. Last but not least, I think that there was a sincere effort within the design to capture some regional style within the housing that was built so that it complemented the places where the housing was being installed. So if you look at the travel trailers that were being used right after Hurricane Katrina, you could not tell whether that travel trailer was being placed in Mississippi or Texas or any other place, whereas I think that there was some effort in the design to try to complement some of the architectural styles that are common in those areas. We had separate teams that focused on different elements during the building science evaluation. One team specialized in factory-built housing. And so when we sent that team into every plant that was supplying these particular programs, we had them focus on the quality program, production rate. We also had them look at processing bottlenecks and also whether or not some basic moisture prevention guidelines that have been established by HUD in assistance with Manufacturing Housing Research Alliance have been followed. And so just to summarize across programs, the one thing that was evident within the product that was being constructed in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana is that they did have a third party running the quality program. So they had people looking over their shoulder and making sure that product was being built as to the specification and such. The lone exception was the Texas product, and that was largely because that containerized, panelized product was really not being governed as a modular product or manufactured housing product. It was really coming from overseas, and it had not been codified by any of those particular organizations that would typically monitor that. One thing to note is that there was a wide range of production between Mississippi and, say, Louisiana. And if you look, these are really the peak capacities that housing could have been produced per day for any given plant. So within Mississippi, they produced at approximately 9 different locations. And if you look at the rates, you could have anything from 3 to 5 houses being produced a day. Whereas if you look at Texas, their peak was around, 1 house per week. Now that was stymied because of all of the other things that were going on, so we never quite got a chance to see what their true maximum performance could have been. And so you've got to take that number with a grain of salt because, like I said, there was a lot of disruptions in the process that prevented them from being able to install any quicker. We had a lot of our experts in the plant basically monitoring the process to see whether or not the workflow was being interrupted by these housing types. Because there were some aspects to this house for every program that was different from the retail factory-built housing that those plants were normally building. So one big question was, if you have this enhanced design with a lot of additional structural features, what impact would that have on the process and the throughput through the plant? And one item that we did notice is that one plant within the Mississippi Grantee program had about 18% of their processes slowed down dramatically because they were not really designed to handle that particular product. And they were building 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom cottages. But the way that their plant was designed and how this particular product was designed, they had at least 3 or 4 station areas where they were just bogged down because it was so much different. And a lot of that had to do with some of the roofing products that were being spec'd, metal roofs instead of some of the normal things that they would normally use, and some of the other products that they would use as well in terms of how they would frame. All that being said, not that much was seen in terms of bottlenecks if you look at the entirety of all of the programs. Within the moisture prevention guidelines, I would say for the ones that we've tagged as most, you probably had 2 to 3 areas where there was not as much following of those particular guidelines. And a lot of that had to do with the best practices that had already been established within the plant and them having a confidence that the way they were doing it would not lead to any future problems. Now, when we migrated into the field, some of the people who were on the teams that were within the plants also went into the field. And then we had some people who were just exclusively in the field. We evaluated the permitting process to see step by step what they had to do in order to prepare the site to receive factory-built housing, and then also what they had to do in order to build the steel framing housing. And you know, the normal delays that you would expect, weather was always an issue across the board for all of the programs. I would say the biggest issue with Texas was definitely permitting, and the biggest issue outside of weather with Mississippi was transport. Because they were trying to deliver so many units, the factory was able to supply these units to their staging area, and what they really had to stand up was actually an installer section to actually carry out all of the houses. At the peak, I believe they were at 20 sets per day. But if you think about that, and you think about some of these smaller counties where a building code official may deal with a couple of housing permits a month, or maybe a couple every 2 weeks, that's a tall order to try to build 2,800 homes. So what they did was they set up some memorandums of understanding to expand that capability for inspection and permitting. And you know, that became less of an issue as the program progressed. We also evaluated whether or not some basic preparation for workforce and supervision was in place. So that looked good. Generally speaking, I would say you had most of the work being coordinated fairly well and well-defined. In these two cases, you would have some instances where you had very well-defined specs or fairly well-defined specs, but you may not have had as well-coordinated workers on the ground. And so we would cite those things as well. Last but not least, this particular metric we paid close attention to because this would tell you whether or not the quality of the work was being executed fairly well, because if you had to come back and do a lot of rework, then that could have meant that these other ratings were exaggerated. So the only one that was, you know, below the 90s is the Texas project. And again, I would say part of that had to do with each jurisdiction not recognizing that as a standard product and requiring a lot more on the part of the Texas grantee to prove that that housing was fit for occupancy. And so you may have to come back and rework something because it was red tagged for one reason or another. So it was very much a case-by-case installation for this particular product. If you look at some of the blower door testing, duct blaster testing, air infiltration testing, and energy use testing that we did, we were able to, you know, realize fairly good air tightness factors for these two houses, and I would even say Louisiana. Even though these panelized structures came together, they were on a whole significantly higher. And if you look here, for new construction, typically a very good air exchange rate would be 0.2 to 0.3. So if you look at that, that's the comparison there. Energy, just to sum up, real good, generally speaking, if you compared that to what a normal home uses. These are much smaller homes, so take that into account as well. If we go to the indoor air quality, we did do the same protocol that the CDC ran for testing formaldehyde in these houses. We also tested the total VOC rates, and we also established what the medians were for these houses as well. The one thing I will point out is that the Texas houses that we tested did have a significantly higher reading, and what we will note is that when they tested their house unfurnished, they had a reading of 0.0169. So what we deduced from this was that some of the furnishings outside of cabinetry and the normal product that goes to build the building shell were not really the sources of the formaldehyde for this particular house. The moisture and long-term durability, we did experience issues here with moisture on the flooding from Hurricane Gustav. We had some issues, observed some issues within the crawl space in Alabama because of how the sites were graded and how water was being drained back into the crawl space and how that manifests itself within the subfloor. Same issue, or not same issue, but a similar issue within Louisiana with subfloor and how that was actually detailed. Ceiling penetrations was a real big deal for some of the housing in Texas where they didn't seal the penetrations well enough. And no wind events, no big issues there. And durability-wise, minor. I would say the biggest issue, site grading for that. Last but not least, we have this maintenance history. I'll just point out that most of the complaints fall within the other category, which were more or less nail pops, cosmetic or aesthetic issues that people would have to revisit and repair. It's notable that no structural complaints were observed in Alabama. We did not get data for Texas because that program ended early. And also, we did not have enough occupancy in Louisiana to track that data. So that was not available either. 5 quick conclusions. If you look at this housing, other than the size, we would argue that the quality of construction is on par with what you would expect for normal construction that would be retail. And in some cases, structurally superior, and maybe even energy superior in some cases. In terms of the time, I would say that the biggest time lag is in the bigger process of construction, not the time that it takes to build the factory-built construction. So that's not, in the critical path, that's not the laggard. That's not the part that's the bottleneck. Indoor air quality may be affected by household furnishings beyond some of the typical sources that we recognize right now. Hazard mitigation is critical to any rebuilding effort. That's evident from Hurricane Gustav and the issues in the floodplain. Last but not least, I would say housing recovery plans are key, and they have to be a part of any kind of community-level pre-disaster planning. And I'll leave it at that, turn things over to Dana.
This process was built on normal housing development process where we blend quality, speed, and cost. The problem here is that we had to add quantity to the mix, which makes the whole process a lot harder. The standard joke, the old contractor saying you can have good, fast, or cheap, pick 2. Well, now we just added that extra dimension, so it gets really hard. And this provided an opportunity to look at a bunch of different approaches to see basically a salad bar for the future. So we can pick things that work and pick things that work for us. The relevance for this is disasters will occur everywhere. Whether this is Louisiana or whether this is the Red River up in North Dakota, this is an opportunity to learn, to figure out how to do it in our communities, wherever our communities are. And it's important for community viability. If we blast a community and we can't provide housing, we can't have we need housing, jobs, people for a community to come back. And if you don't have all 3, don't even bother trying, because you're not going to bring it off. And I'll pander. Design professionals need to be at the table. This is not something that the cops and firefighters can do. This is something that builders, architects, engineers, community planners need to be involved with. There, pandering to the audience. The disaster truths. Temporary housing isn't temporary. There was a photograph of a 1906 California, San Francisco earthquake temporary disaster housing product that was available for sale a year or so ago. 105 years later, we still got them. Hopefully we'll do better with Katrina stuff, but the bottom line is we need to be in a position to do this. And temporary housing is expensive. The faster we can get people in permanent housing, the better off the communities are, the better off the nation is. And again, did I say housing was essential for community recovery? So the disaster housing requires planning. Planners basically it's the same crowd that we know and love. Urban planners, community planners, land use planners, building code guys, builders, architects, engineers, especially engineers. And do it early and often. And because FEMA is going to ask, FEMA is now asking what the communities want, and if the communities don't know, then they're not going to get where they need to be. Here's the baseline. We had travel trailers, park models, and HUD code units, all in the lovely shade of white. And the problem here is accessibility is an issue, energy efficiency is an issue, and cost of maintenance. You see here we have, every time we visited that unit, they took a magic marker and noted it. That's pretty expensive. The alternatives, and available in quantity. So we have we have some decent alternatives that that are both attractive and and perform better. The construction features, we meet and exceed existing codes. High wind speeds, fiber cement siding, really good quality products. We're using products that you would use on your home. There's nothing, we made no differences here between what we would do on our homes and what we would do here. Site built, the IRC compliant, steel framing. I'm a big fan of factory construction. You're doing it indoors, you're doing it in the shade, you're doing it out of the rain, and you have the opportunity to have somebody with a set of plans looking at them while they're doing the work. It takes a lot of the challenge out of it. You have machines lifting things for you. So it's just easier. It's easier on everybody, and you get a higher quality product. Then we did permanent installation. We have permanent installations in Alabama, up here, and this is one down in Biloxi. Obviously, there's they brought it up to get it out of the flood zone, and there's going to be some accessibility issues there. That family is not likely to need to be using a wheelchair. But you see, they can do it. The choices, the bottom line here is the disaster housing has to include good design, has to include appropriate siting. If you put it in a bad location, it's not going to work. Simple, easily constructed homes are always easier to bring off successfully. We should basically look at the target and move to the target. Look through the process and shoot for things that you can do successfully. Durable materials, smaller footprints. And the AHPP is going to help inform that process. Here we have the Hurricane Gustav performance. This unit got knocked off its foundation because of the flooding. Got knocked off its foundation, got really wet, got banged up, but the roof, the wall to ceiling line was dead straight. The walls, the corners were still square. The unit survived structurally, even though from a moisture standpoint it was a write-off. But the unit itself remained structurally intact. Accessibility, the UFUS controls the design. Builders frequently don't know how to bring that off. They need help. They need help from the government. They need help from the designers. They need help from everybody, because ignorance might lead to inaccessible units or violations of the UFUS requirement, which is shown right here. That was actually the picture on the website, and the railings are wrong. Design of material. Selecting materials that are resistant to damage from water. Because the more durable the materials, the more durable the unit, the better it'll perform for the long run. Planning. Move to higher density. That was a great thing that we did in Alabama. Built 100 units outside the floodplain in a nice compact neighborhood. In the mayor's backyard, right across the street from where the mayor lives. There was no NIMBY there. It was an endorsement of the idea. It's up at 80 feet elevation. Land use planning. If it's too dangerous to do, don't do it. And land use is all the big L local. There's no way to bring it off successfully without getting the locals involved. And we can look at better ways to do development and to get the density we need. to avoid building in high-risk places. Mitigation. Mitigation is our friend. The cheapest way to mitigate something is in the planning process. You know, kind of a classic, you know, the wisdom of our mothers, avoid doing dumb things. Selecting materials helps with that as well. And what have we learned? We need to blend the performance of the units. We need to blend the community involvement. Professional planning and design is critical. Plant the seeds of recovery. This is an opportunity to get the community on the track to recovery. Why do building science people, why do community planners need to be involved? Because the players are all the same. You know, you get an extra player in the FEMA and the emergency management folks, but everybody else is the same. You know, and we're unlikely to find a silver bullet. There's unlikely to be the thing that we haven't figured out yet. And where are we now? We're completing Louisiana, Mississippi, operating units in Alabama, redeploying units from Mississippi, occupying units in Louisiana, and now we're trying to transfer this information to others that can use it.
Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. I would like to ask two questions. First is, I think there was a slide that talked about in the Mississippi housing that you had like 640 Mississippi cottages and 640 were completed. And of the eco cottages, only 1 out of 60 are completed. I just would like to know the reason. I'm sure there's a sort of simple reason. But more importantly, I was just wondering about the concept that you brought up at the end there about really temporariness, or if that's a good word or whatever, of some of these communities that are made. In other words, how long are people meant to perceive themselves being in these units in terms of the bringing of, say, as somebody mentioned, leveraging for trees or for other infrastructure so that it becomes a home itself? Do these communities have a stigma attached to them in being, quote, disaster housing that you're not going to stay in for too long? Or what exactly does happen in most cases to the houses and to the people themselves on a long-term basis?
I can answer to the first question, and I don't know how we want to divide up the second question. The first question in terms of Mississippi is that Mississippi, they built a little over 3,000 units. They occupied and placed 2,826 of those units. There was a little bit of excess inventory in terms of what the need was versus what the demand was, but ultimately all of those units, as they move towards permanency, are finding an appropriate, what we hope is an appropriate outcome, which is to continue to assist ultimately in the recovery. On the Eco Cottage program, what we're seeing is that right now, the reason it's 1 of 60 is because the program's ongoing. It's a program that has been delayed. It's been delayed for a whole myriad of reasons, and we'd like to see that program progress. The expectation is that those cottages, those eco cottages, the more environmentally friendly designs, that what we'll be seeing is construction complete roughly around June, with occupancy soon to follow. So we're actually looking at a fairly rapid construction time frame for the 3 sites that are taking place in Mississippi with that eco cottage design.
I can take first stab at the second part of your question, and then Dana, if you want to add to that. Traditionally, our authorities all stem from what we have legislative authority to provide. And so from FEMA's perspective, disaster housing programs are intended to be up to 18 months based on the needs of each individual household. And then, you know, if needed, sometimes that will get extended longer if that's in the public interest or if there is still a significant number of households that have a longer lasting need. So that obviously presents quite a challenge when you're talking about trying to not just build on available housing resources and providing a means of accessing those available housing resources, but actually bringing in and constructing new resources, including some of the temporary type housing units and some of the more longer-lasting permanent HPP. Katrina was large enough and the impact was so broad that basically rewrote the rules as far as what we define as a catastrophic event and how long we need to start thinking in terms of the length of time for disaster housing to provide. So again, we're trying to learn the lessons from this program. This obviously, the AHPP wasn't even implemented until after traditional disaster housing has ramped down in a smaller scale event. So again, I think that's an excellent question, and it certainly points to some of the complexities and the lessons that we're hoping to draw from this program.
Yeah, and from a community planning standpoint, looking through the process to the end state, to the permanent solution is a good strategy. Obviously, we're all bounded by statute, so I think that the AHPP is a great process in allowing the communities to move to permanency, and I believe that's ultimately going to benefit the communities. And we're seeing that in Alabama already. The fact that this is serving as a to strengthen the communities. So permanent housing is what works for communities. And the sooner we can get families into housing that performs well, that they feel comfortable in, that contributes to the community, the better off the communities are.
This is a specific question for Mr. Peavy. One of your last slides, you showed that there were 9% of structural complaints in Mississippi. I think it was your durability slide. That was a surprising number to me, and if you could explain that.
For the maintenance, that was the maintenance slide. What we did was we compiled or gathered from the grantees' records their classification for typical structural issues that they had. Most of those structural issues actually had to do with how, I guess they fell two ways, but the bulk of those were the structures that were added onto the Mississippi cottages once they were brought and set. So when they came from the plant, you had not only to have to put stairs in and sometimes ramps in, sometimes because of how they were transported, they needed to repair different aspects of the structure itself that didn't travel well or had a mishap during the travel. So you could have seen in the records either structural issues with the porches areas, with the stair areas, or with the ramp areas, and in some instances, even with the larger structure of the product itself or the house itself as it was delivered. And so that is a fairly large number, but I would say, if I were to just guess from the records, most of those were on the secondary structural aspects. Stairs, porches which were already attached but may have gotten more damage in transit than the main part of the unit.
Do you think that the lessons that you've learned in the construction that you've been doing and working with all the community groups, do you think that's going to influence the way that construction is done in those areas at risk in the future?
Let me take that one. Yeah, yeah, I think they will. I believe that not only are most of these units better than what was lost during the storm, in many communities they're better than what survived the storm. These are first-rate houses, without regard to the jurisdiction we're talking about. And I believe that that's going to raise the bar. No longer are we going to, the communities know what they can do, and they can, they have examples all over the place of houses done right. So that's going to help raise the bar. Is it going to be perfect? Probably not. Is it going to increase the choices for families and trying to have a good, safe place to live? Without a doubt.
Trying to think through sort of the practical implications. God forbid we have another disaster. Are we going to see travel trailers used? Are we going to, I know that the AHPP is really about experimentation, but with FEMA's charge and going in after the next disaster, you're not going to use grantees presumably, but are you going to look to the emergency management personnel of a state or a locality, or is it community development professionals, or is, what is HUD's role? I mean, what are sort of the lessons projected forward as a practical matter, God forbid our next disaster?
I think this one's yours.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of different pieces to that question. And first of all, I'm going to focus on what you ask in terms of working with states, emergency managers, community planners, and the role of HUD. One of the things that we have been talking about for probably the last 2 to 2.5 years is to encourage states to develop a state disaster housing task force, and by doing that, engaging the rest of the sort of housing and community development community that typically emergency managers really hadn't necessarily worked all that closely with, or certainly not in a formalized type structure. So we actually have, I believe 27 states now have established, at least nominally, some form of housing task force that's looking at disaster housing. So that's the primary way that FEMA has been engaging more along the lines of trying to encourage some of the pre-disaster planning. Obviously, if we have a catastrophic level event of this magnitude, I think that we're going to find a lot of options remain on the table, particularly as we still go through the process of trying to learn and incorporate a lot of the lessons from this ongoing program. So at the moment, could we use travel trailers? We certainly don't want to limit our toolbox in what we can provide. Is that our preferred method? Definitely not. Direct housing of any form is our last alternative. And I think that it's surprising to folks to find out that it actually is very rare that we provide something like that. I think what we also need to be looking at is other innovative approaches of developing ways in which people can take better advantage of existing housing resources, either through financial assistance, looking at some form of temporary relocation as communities are determining what their permanent in-state might look like and how we can best support that. So we are looking across the board at a lot of different ways of doing business. Dana or Mikhail, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, there, after some of the Midwest floods, the FEMA actually experimented with rapid rental repair, where they went in and they helped local organizations bring rental units that might not have been damaged during the event, but bring rental units on, because a family who needs a house doesn't care whether the house was damaged due to the disaster or just was unoccupied. Right. It's a house. So they were able to work with some nonprofits to bring some housing online quickly and affordably, which is, and providing permanent housing in communities that needed good housing, for folks that don't have a lot of flexibility. So there's a bunch of choices, and I don't think we should, I think we should probably plan on trying to use every one that makes sense.
Exactly.
This gentleman over here has the honor of asking our final question of the evening.
Right? Hi. It's a three-parter. And I'm going to go this way. The science guy, I want the first answer from. I'm a process guy and a numbers guy too, so I really liked your presentation. Has there been any analysis done for, I also build houses kind of part-time. Cost per square foot, type of analysis, and I'm going somewhere with this.
Well, here's the challenge with that metric. It's a common metric for all housing and architect and technical types. But it's misleading because every technical element to the house is not kind of correlated to square footage. Well, let me give you an excellent example. I won't be long with it. Think about when people talk about energy and then they give you a square footage. Well, that's not just depending on how big the house is, but how many windows is it and what the wall is made of. Think about when people talk about water utilization. Well, that's not about how big the house is, that's about how many people are in the house and how long the showers are and whether they're using the washing machine and those things. To answer your question, we thought about deducing certain metrics to square footage, but they weren't scalable by square footage. So we thought that would be too misleading. So where possible, we gave people raw data. This is what the numbers are. And then you could look at that and compare it to a number that was similar versus a square footage and think, oh, that's scalable, I'm going to multiply by this, and this is how much better it would be or how much worse.
Well, here's where I'm going, and maybe I used the wrong metric to start out with, but what I'm thinking about is I realize that this is going to be more expensive right off the bat.
Right.
Because you have all the other considerations that don't normally come with building a house in a development that's already been pre-planned. So given that, has there been any analysis or any consideration done to, given how long it's taken, I'm not doing a hindsight 2020 thing, I'm doing foresight lessons learned. In terms of getting putting the money towards the permanent housing to start with, rather than doing the temporary housing? Because it seems like, for instance, and I've lived in Texas, so I think I can say this, they owe you a refund. They owe us a refund, right? I mean, based on what got done versus how much they got, because they didn't perform, whoever the grantee was. So if the money went towards the permanent solution, it may be a little bit more, but then it would be permanent. So I'm just wondering about that.
You know, let me say it this way. If you look at the most successful grantee, in my opinion, it would be Alabama, because they took a real stark, candid look at their issues, and they looked at the population that they would be serving, and they knew that it wasn't going to be a temporary thing. So when they sat down, they got to the point of saying, this is going to be a permanent circumstance. We're going to have a permanent solution. Now, if you look at the other grantees, like, say, Mississippi, maybe they thought 18 months is all we need and people will be back on their feet again. For Texas, I look at that circumstance and I think that what I took away from that technically was that you cannot underestimate how important it is to have good construction management on any project, including these. So what I always found as kind of mystifying to me was every time I would turn on the TV, people would say, why isn't this done yet? And why isn't that so easy? You know, you give me the money, I can do it easily. Yeah, talk to Texas. They thought the same thing. And if you talk to the people who were the experts at that housing, they had done thousands of these in the desert for the military. You know, and maybe under those circumstances, you have to make sure that the general is satisfied and that the soldiers are well protected within that. But if you're trying to put this in a community, you've got the local jurisdictions to satisfy, you've got the permitting to satisfy. This was a totally new thing for those experts. And so to me, it exemplified the importance of knowing that process back and forth and being able to engage the community, the building code officials, all of the people who are concerned about knowing, yes, you're not just going to put this up and we're going to take on faith that this is going to work. So a lot of the resistance they got was that people were unsure if that housing, you know, was fit for occupancy.
Yeah, we regularly see, you know, we accept houses that look like the houses that we've accepted in the past. You know, we're, you know, as innovative as we like to think we are with respect to our housing, we're not particularly innovative. We want things that look kind of like the house we grew up in. And, you know, so when you bring something really new in, there's a lot of education, there's a lot of coaching, there's a lot of hand-holding. And people want, you know, and that adds a lot of normalcy to the neighborhood. You know, maybe that's the reason we don't like the new thing, because it doesn't look like the neighborhood. You know, we want that feeling of normalcy. And I think Mikhail can talk, you know, there is, you know, not all of the money that Texas, you know, of the original grant that Texas received FEMA still has the vast majority of it.
I think the interesting part of the question that I really want to focus on is what is appropriate in terms of short-term versus the long-term housing. And the answer that I would offer is to say that it really is situation specific. That careful analysis is required in order to try to assess the particular impacts of a disaster, its impacts on a community, and how best to address that. And the question that I would often have is, what is the federal role in that? What is the state role? And what is the local role? And how is it that we work together to do that work? This is, I think, pointing back to the importance of state-led disaster housing task forces. This, I think, is in the pre-disaster planning components. This is communities trying to understand what risks they could be subject to and how those risks might ultimately impact their future plans. Because a disaster, a significant portion, is going to interrupt the vision of a community. And at some point, they have to stop, pause, and try to figure it out again. But in the meantime, there's still people who have needs.
So with that, we'll wrap it up. Let's have another hand for our panelists.